Hey everyone, I'm Kevin Keckstadt, creator of Your Success PDQ. What I do is I help people build stronger communication skills through various workshops as well as one-on-one coaching. Now in a previous video I had mentioned the 6 basic aspects regarding a basic speech framework, and those being the opening, the body, the conclusion of the speech, as well as the 3 traits that the speaker brings to the speech, being the ethos, the pathos, and the logos. In this particular video, I'm going to delve a little more deeply, specifically regarding the body of the speech. Now, when it comes to framing up a body of your speech, you basically want to keep your points to 2 to 3 points. You don't want to exceed that limit for the most part. And the reason for this is twofold. The first is, if you are laying out more than 3 points, it becomes more difficult for the audience to remember your points by the end of your speech. And the other reason is it becomes easier for you as a presenter to build in a effective takeaway or call to action if you lay out 2 to 3 strong points as opposed to half a dozen or more points that you can't really delve into. Now, with regards to the first claim, most of your audience is not there taking notes. Again, for the most part, they may be there taking notes if your speech is an informational, but even that's not guaranteed. But when it comes to an impromptu speech, or perhaps a persuasive speech or an inspirational speech, for the most part your audience is not there taking notes. So if you're throwing out 6 or 8 or 10 points, it becomes very difficult, very problematic for them to follow along in your speech as to where you are. Now, hopefully at the beginning of your speech, in the opening of your speech, you basically laid out what it was you were going to unpack regarding your speech, and you stick to that format. And again, if at the opening of your speech, if you let your audience know the 2 or 3 points you're going to unpack as you move through your speech, it becomes easier for them to identify where they are at within your speech. You said you're going to talk about points A, B, and C, and you're on point B. It becomes very easy for them to zone in on that. As opposed to if at the beginning of your speech you said, well, I'm going to talk about 13 things, by the 5th or 6th or 7th things, your audience becomes overwhelmed and they can't keep track of where they are within your speech. Which leads me to my second point. Anything after 4 or 5, you run the risk of your audience beginning to tune out. And certainly if they're not taking notes, if you're giving an impromptu speech and your audience is there perhaps to get some information, after the 4th or 5th point they begin zoning out because it's just too overwhelming. Now, when it comes to building a takeaway into your speech, it's easier to lay out 2 to 3 points, build very strongly on them, make them crystal clear, and at that point all the references that you make are still fresh in the audience's mind. It's easier for them to go back and refresh themselves with things that you have mentioned earlier on. I know from personal experience, there was a speech I'd given 5-6 years ago, and I was so proud of myself. In the span of 10 minutes, it was less than 10 minutes actually, I had laid out 17 points. But at the end of the speech, not even at the end of the speech, during the speech, I noticed that 2 things were happening. The first is that half of the audience was looking around for a pen and a paper to start writing down these notes, because they didn't want to miss any of it. And the other half of the audience, they just got this glazed over look in their eye, like, well, I can't follow along with this. Now, although all my points were valid points, it was just too much that was jammed into a short period of time. And in the meantime, what happened, the people who were looking for a pen and paper to write stuff down, and the people who had zoned out, I had basically lost the whole audience. My speech was ineffective. So that's basically where you're at as a speaker. You want your speech to be effective. You want your audience to be able to follow along. You want your audience to be able to make sense of what your presentation is. And at the end, you want them to understand your call to action, or understand your takeaway, and to be clear on that, and not sort of be muddled somewhere in the middle where you may have said something and they weren't too clear on that, and then you went past that because you had a timeline you had to adhere to. So again, keep your points to 2 to 3 points max, and just build on those points. The other point that I want to bring into this is that your opening is about, for example, in a 10-minute speech, your opening should be, about 1.5 minutes. And if you're bringing in 3 points, then you're unpacking, you're expanding on each of those points for about 2.5 minutes each before you wrap up your presentation. And that gives you enough time to have the audience make sense of what you're presenting to them. However, if you're presenting 14 points or 17 points, you're basically only, you're confined to 20 to 30 seconds for each point that you're putting up there, and clearly that's not enough time to have an audience make sense of that. Clearly, if each of your points is a 20-second time limit, then each of your points is actually less than your introduction. It's not going to bode well. It's not going to adhere to any sort of call to action or any sort of takeaway from there. So I just want to bring that up and have you consider that as you're putting your next presentation together. So again, as you're putting your presentation together, put a sort of a cap on 2 to 3 points. There may be the odd time when you have to go into 4 points, but for the most part, like I say, keep your points at 2 to 3 max. I hope that serves you. Work with it as best you can. In the meantime, if there's any questions, please feel free to email them to me at www.yoursuccesspdq. In the meantime, have a great day and serve each other as best you can.